Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's event organized by the UBS International Center of Economics in Society jointly with the Department of Economics. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Professor Robert Shiller to you. Robert Shiller is a professor of economics at Yale University and at the same time also a professor of finance and a fellow at the International Center for Finance at the Yale School of Management. He has been a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research since 1980, was president of the Eastern Economic Association, and is the current president of the American Economic Association. He has won many prizes and acknowledgments, so he has been named, included in Bloomberg's 50 most influential people in 2011, most influential people in global finance, and in 2013, he won the Nobel Prize in Economics jointly with Eugene Fama and Lars Peter Hansen. Many of you know his publications. He's a best-selling author. He didn't just publish in economic or academic journals. He's a best-selling author, has written many books and papers on financial markets, financial innovation, behavioral economics, macroeconomics, real estate, statistical methods, on public attitudes, opinions, and on moral judgments regarding markets. He has written several books that sold very well, among them Irrational Exuberance, or The Subprime Solution, How the Global Financial Crisis Happened and What to Do About It, or his book jointly with George Akerlof on Animal Spirits, How Human Psychology Drives the Economy and Why It Matters for Global Capitalism. A few years ago, Bob was already at a similar event in Zurich. At that time, he had just published his book on finance and the good society. In this book, he makes a powerful case for recognizing that finance, far from being a parasite on society, is one of the most powerful tools we have for solving our common problems and increasing the general well-being. He was arguing that we need not less but more financial innovation, and that finance should generally play a larger role in helping society to achieve its goals. In that book, he describes how finance has historically contributed to the good of society through inventions such as insurance, mortgages, savings accounts, and pensions, and argues that we need to envision new ways to design financial market forces to benefit society as a whole. Thus, he's clearly in favor of a flourishing market economy, and he knows that only a market-based economy can help solve key problems we are facing. However, this does not mean that unfettered and completely unregulated markets are always the best solution. And so in his latest book, Fishing for Fools, The Economics of Manipulation and Deception, jointly with another Nobel Prize winner, George Akerlof, he argues that, quotation, competitive markets by their very nature spawn deception and trickery. As long as there is profit to be made, sellers will systematically exploit our psychological weaknesses and our ignorance through manipulation and deception. Rather than being essentially benign and always creating the greater good, markets sometimes are inherently filled with tricks and traps and will fish us as fools. Now, this book is, together with the emerging theoretical literature, the next logical step that follows from acknowledging that a sizable share of the people are not perfectly but only boundedly rational. So it's a logical, basically, it follows logically from the insights of behavioral economics. When humans have weaknesses, then there are typically people who try to exploit these weaknesses. And this is the topic of his new book. However, I do not intend to anticipate the content of this lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I give you Bob Shiller.
Thank you. I want also to thank you and the UBS International Center of Economics and Society for inviting me. I've been very intrigued by the center and its activities, and I'm trying to see a match between me and the activities. I'm thinking that when you talk about economics in society, that suggests a more, an approach that looks at values and purposes, and also, to me, real-world issues and advice that we might give as a result of our work. So I'm happy to give a presentation of my book with George Akerlof, Fishing for Fools. And I wanted to start by saying something about the genesis of this book. I think, first of all, I wanted to work with George Akerlof because he shares some of the values that I see in the center here at Zurich. It's something, well, I thought working with George would would result in some good things because of his independent and creative spirit. This is my second book with George. Now, Jason Zweig, who wrote a review of our book for the Wall Street Journal, claims, and I can't think that he's wrong, that it's very unusual to have two authors co-author a book for the second time. He says, no, we actually really co-authored this book. This was not part one by him and part two. We were crossing out each other's lines and arguing. I have to say it did get a little bit like a troubled marriage at times, but we have not had a divorce. So I'm trying to say something about my co-author who would ideally be here, but maybe I wouldn't say these things if he were here. One thing is that he has a habit of looking at things that seem obvious to many people and not worthy of academic study. But after you read him, you decide it wasn't so obvious. So in his case, in 1970, Akerlof wrote a paper called The Market for Lemons. A lemon in popular usage is a used car that looks okay, but it's going to break down on you at the worst possible time. And you worry about that when you buy a used car. So his paper explained why the market for lemons isn't really all there, that people don't buy used cars, and they don't sell them either. They give them to their family member. And there's something of different kind of market failure. So he sent his article to a scholarly journal, and it was rejected 3 times in a row. And the referee said, this is obvious. But he finally got it published, and it then became the basis for his Nobel Prize. And it eventually became the basis for a whole literature on information asymmetries in economics. So I've decided I would stay with him in researching things that might not be as obvious as they seem. He also did another paper called The Economics of the Rat Race, which explained why it is that we all work too hard. Maybe we don't all work too hard, but I bet people in this room work too hard. And it has something to do with information asymmetries. You're trying to prove yourself. Okay, now that sounds obvious too, but it was a wonderful paper. And I believe he's absolutely right. You do work too hard. I shouldn't talk so aggressively to people I don't know, but I think it's not about you, it's the economics of it, that you have to prove yourself, and it's a part of an equilibrium. And he wrote a paper with Paul Romer called Looting, the Economics of Bankruptcy for Profit, which was the thing that really led directly to this book. Namely, you normally assume, economic theory assumes that firms are at least trying to make a profit. Well, in some cases, that's the furthest thing from their imagination, because they're doing a fraud on the government, and they're only staying in business to permit other things to happen, and they document this. All these were the most strange and unusual papers And they were all, to my mind, challenging orthodoxy in economics. So we wrote a book in 2009 called Animal Spirits. That term, animal spirits, is actually a phrase that has been used popularly for over 2,000 years. In Latin, spiritus animalis. I did a search. You can search the ancient world now. I tracked it back to 200 BC. But what are animal spirits? It's the spirit that motivates you, that gets you down to work and to do things. And we argued that animal spirits, well, it was actually John Maynard Keynes who talked about animal spirits as an important driving force in an economy. Economists didn't know what to make of that. What does he mean, animal spirits? What are animal spirits? We're not referring to animals as little things that run around outside. We're referring to animating. What makes you do things? What inspires you to be an entrepreneur, or what? And I think our thoughts, Keynes articulated that, but wasn't able to. Keynes was a very original thinker, but he wasn't able to make it clear to everyone. I think that we're getting more toward understanding what animal spirits might be with more modern research in behavioral economics and neuroscience. I'm reminded of some work here at Zurich that Ernst Fehr and others have been involved with about the hormone oxytocin. That's the warm, fuzzy hormone that makes you feel altruistic. And it changes the way you play games, as the Zurich researchers found. Women, while they're nursing babies, get flooded with oxytocin. It gives you a fuzzy, warm feeling. Something like that is going on in the economy, too, but that's not my subject for today. So George suggested that we write a book that challenges some of the most basic principles of modern economics and our belief in unregulated free markets. And I thought, maybe this is obvious, but maybe it isn't obvious. And so I thought, let's work on this. So we wrote a book called Fishing for Fools. Now, fishing in English is normally spelled with an F. But in the mid-1990s, it acquired a second, well, it actually became another word, a homonym, pronounced the same, but spelled differently, spelled with a PH. And that referred to a kind of internet fraud. You're careful about it, right? You know about phishing, and you don't just answer a random message that you get. So what we thought is that's a metaphor for a lot more things that go on. There's a lot of manipulation and deception. Tricks are being played on you. We coined the term fool with a PH also. And that's not the Indian word fool, which we discovered later. It refers to someone who doesn't appreciate how often you are being manipulated or tricked. Often relatively harmless tricks, but in total magnitude, a lot. And we say there's two kinds of fools with a PH. Information fools are people who just don't know something about a product or a service that they use, and the providers are sure not going to tell you. They'll rely on the state of lack of information that you have. And there's psychological fools. That's people who are being manipulated through psychology. So you qualify as a fool if you don't appreciate how much you are being fooled. That's us, George and I. Writing the book was kind of a revelation. But we're getting at a fundamental criticism of canonical economic theory. So it's not everyone, but a lot of people in the profession are still adhering to an old-style economic thinking. I take it back to the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who in the beginning of the 19th century defined a branch of philosophy called utilitarianism, saying that the ultimate objective in our society ought to be to make people happy. And he used the word utility as a synonym for happy. Now that's an interesting choice of words, because I think useful or utilitarian sounds different from happy to me. We're starting to feel that maybe we don't understand what happiness is. There's the famous experiment of Danny Kahneman, a behavioral psychologist, economist, showing that people don't remember how happy they were. And by manipulating the experiment, you can produce evidence, which is incontrovertible, that if people had a miserable experience, but you top it off with a dessert, they forget. They don't know how bad it was. So if we don't even know whether we're happy or not, where does that leave utilitarianism? But core economic theory has adopted the idea of a utility function and equating that with happiness. So everyone has a function that maps their consumption of goods and services into their utility, which we equate with happiness. And the goal of an economist is to help people maximize their utility. One of the most famous results, which is taught now in programs in economics, is the principle of Pareto optimality. This is named after, as it happens, a Swiss economist at Lausanne University, Vilfredo Pareto, who wrote in a famous work that there is a sense in which a competitive, unregulated, free market equilibrium will make everyone optimally happy, in the sense that you couldn't possibly make anyone better off without harming someone else. And he took that as a standard for economics to achieve. And then the economics profession adopted an attitude, many of them, that this is the final word about economics, except for two considerations. One is externalities, that sometimes what I do harms another person, not just through my effect on market prices, but directly. For example, if I pollute the air, that's an externality, and the equilibrium will not be optimal. The other thing is distribution of income or inequality. Maybe you want to add a progressive tax system or something to redistribute income. But that was the end of it. So that is a framework which is widely used and is used to justify unregulated free markets. You have to show me that there's an externality, otherwise I won't even consider interfering with free markets. Now, that view is problematical, even before we started researching psychology and economics. One of the first critics and most vociferous critics of this concept was none other than Vilfredo Pareto, who, after the years went by, decided that his theory was wrong and that people really weren't maximizing their utility. He had coined another word, ophalimity, to substitute for what people really do. But he finally became disillusioned and dropped out of economics and became a sociologist for the rest of his life. He's a brilliant man. He did other remarkable other things as well. That was in 1918, almost 100 years ago, Irving Fisher from Yale University gave a famous lecture in which he said, you know, the economists have it wrong. By the word utility is what's wrong. What we should say is that people are maximizing something, but it's not utility, because people do so many foolish things in reality. It's just reality. So he suggested that the economics profession should drop this word utility, which was so carefully chosen to make it sound important and right, and call it wantability. That is not, well, I think it might be in your dictionary, but he coined it in 1918. So I tracked the word wantability in Google Ngrams to see how often it was used. And it was very popular right after 1918 for a while. Lots of people were trying to make the switch. But then it exponentially decayed to nothing, and nobody remembers it anymore. So we're trying to resurrect it. What the economic system does is optimize wantability, not happiness or utility. So what George and I emphasize in this book, and maybe I should have been more upfront about this, the idea of competitive equilibrium is that it puts market forces on businesses, pushing them to try harder all the time because it becomes competitive. Profit margins get squeezed down by competition, and it provides a motive to do something more. But what does it provide a motive to do more? That's the problem. What it does is it provides an incentive to do whatever is necessary to get people to spend money on your profits. If there's no moral standard, there's no intervention at all. So I'll give you a couple of very easy examples. One of them, and these are trivial examples, but we expand on them in the book. One of the examples is candy bars at the checkout of a grocery store. In the United States, most of our examples, I have to apologize, are from the United States. But I think they apply more broadly. But in the 1970s, there was a kind of a consumer complaint that grocery stores would put candy bars right at the checkout. Now, you've selected your groceries, and you maybe have a 5-year-old child with you who's not happy because doesn't like shopping for groceries. And then you pull up to pay, you pull up with your shopping cart, and then right there in front of your child is a whole array of candy bars, and the child is already getting unruly. So mothers started to complain, you know what? They put them there for that reason, because they know that I'm at a weak moment where the child is getting uncontrollable. So for a period of about 5 years after that, I don't have an exact time, many grocery stores stopped doing that. But you know what? They're back. And here's why. The grocery business is very competitive. Profit margins are something like 2%. You cannot not do something like that and stay in business. 2%, you could lose it from not doing something like that. Well, maybe a couple of things like that. And you have these idealistic businesses that say, I won't do that. You know what? They go out of business. Maybe they'll remember for a while, but eventually it all comes back. So here's the fundamental problem. You, as an idealistic business person, if you alone, individually decide, I won't do that practice, then you're going to go out of business. Except in some cases where profit margins give more organizational slack. So it's not universal, but it's a broad tendency. Another example we talk about in the book is Cinnabons. Do you have these in Switzerland? Well, they're in something like 90 countries. So I don't know if you have them here. But this is an outlet that sells cinnamon buns, okay? Now and they're big and highly successful. So then you wonder, I could bake a cinnamon bun. Anyone here could bake a cinnamon bun. How did someone make a business out of that? Well, we think that they were very careful and smart in their location of outlets. They like to put them in airports or train stations or shopping malls where people have time on their hands, and they bake them on the premise. You can smell them baking. And one bun is something like 900 calories. But they don't advertise that. You can find it on your if you go to their website. So you wonder, you're sitting there waiting for an airplane that's delayed, and you smell this cinnamon baked thing, and you think, maybe I'll do it. But do you ever reflect that it's there because you have this need. They've systematized this and they know this. And that's why they're big, because they do things like this. So it's a little bit like as if you walked around all your time with a monkey on your shoulder. And when you go shopping, the monkey is reaching out and grabbing things. And the monkey might bite if you don't give in. So the producers start devising products for the monkey. But see, the really fundamental thing is that, there's been a lot of literature complaining about free market vulgarity or free market tricks. But they tend to be blaming the business people. And we think that's largely wrong, because business people operate under constraints. They know that they have certain constraints. And so they don't want to be dragged down by these market forces, but unless something is done, they will be. And so we don't blame them for playing tricks like this. It's a market, that's the whole core idea here. It's a fishing equilibrium where practices are discovered that map into higher profits, but then the profits eventually are competed away because the whole practice is adopted by others as well. That's economics. Now, the examples I gave of fishing may seem minor. I've talked about candy bars at the checkout counter. It's not a big deal. So in our book, we talk about what we call no one could possibly want. These are things that happen in a fishing equilibrium that you wouldn't want to happen. So one example is personal financial insecurity. Anna Marie Lusardi and her co-authors did a survey in which they asked people in the United States, do you think you could come up with $2,000 in a month if you had to? And most people said no. People are living on the edge. There's a whole financial services system, but it hasn't helped people with that kind of problem. Instead, we have an economic system that looks for ways to make you spend money, not just save money. Now, I'm oversimplifying this, but I'm saying, for example, weddings and funerals are heavily promoted because people are in an emotionally difficult time at those moments, and they're more likely to spend a large amount. Secondly is health. If you look at the kind of services the medical and the drug professions offered before modern regulation and professional societies developed, it was absolutely horrible. Most medicines that you would pick up at a pharmacy were frauds. They would claim that they cure everything. Swaim's panacea. It said right on the bottle, cures, well, it didn't say everything. It had a long list of just about everything. Later, some scientists tested it, and they trying to figure out what's in the secret formula, and they found out that it wasn't even consistent. It looked like it was just flavorings, and it wasn't even the same ingredients from one time to the next. This is where we were in the 19th century. Moreover, there's an incentive for food producers to try to capture you. For example, there was a recent book by Michael Moss called Sugar, Salt, Fat that describes the researchers of food scientists. What do you think food scientists do? Well, some of them are well-meaning, but some of them are hired by firms to increase sales, and they're going to push it up. They're going to find what kind of potato chips you can't stop eating. That's the optimal proportion of salt and fat, not to make you your well-being high, but to make you want to continue to consume them. So the third thing is bad government. Voters are not usually aware of all of the issues that affect a particular industry. And so firms have an incentive to lobby government officials to make the little details work for their product that individuals don't see. So for example, Elizabeth Warren, who was a US Senator, documented how credit card companies, some of them, would put fine print into the document that you would sign to get your credit card that would say that if you ever miss a payment, we'll raise your credit card interest rate to some high level. And then they didn't realize, people who signed the form didn't even read it, and they didn't realize that once their credit score had gone down, they couldn't switch to another credit card company. So they were in trouble. Fourth, addiction by design and the gambling industry. We're relying partly on a book by Natasha Schull called Addiction by Design. She documents that the gambling industry has been changing over the years. It's moving more toward machine gambling, that is slot machines or computer gambling, because they are more able to control the experience and make it addictive. So if you've ever been to a gambling casino, you'll find that they have slot machines, and you'll see people pulling this handle again and again. And why do they do that? Well, it turns out you probably don't do that. You didn't feel particularly. But some people, there's something, a feedback loop that they can slip into if the machine is designed right, that they can't get out of it. When she interviewed slot machine gamblers, they seemed kind of resigned about it. They lose money all the time on it, and they regard it as an addiction. But it gives them, they fall into a zone, that happiness zone for a while they're doing it. Slot machines as gambling machines were first invented in the 1890s. And immediately, in the 1890s, it was reported that there are these people who just play it all the time, every day. And that led to government restrictions. So they then decided, we'll let the slot machines persist, but they've got to be somewhere off for a vacation to break up the gambling. But since then, the slot machine technology has improved. And for example, they discovered that the scientists watched how people play slot machines. They used to, when you pulled the handle and won, coins would come falling out. That was dramatic. But they discovered that many people stopped gambling at that point because it interrupted their trance. And they needed to put these coins somewhere, and so then they decided to stop. So now what they do is they play a recorded sound of coins falling out. And they tell you that your coins have been credited to your account. So you don't have to stop. And they can make you keep going and lose more and more money as a result. They've also optimized the time between gambles. It's like 3 seconds, really short. It just gets you going, and you get stuck in this loop, and you can't get out of it. So now, even in Nevada, which is the gambling center, Las Vegas in the United States, even in Nevada, the Gambling Commission put some limits on this. There was a proposal to, at convenience stores, to have a slot machine right there at the checkout, and they would encourage you to put your money in the slot machine or take it as a gamble on the slot machine. And they decided not to allow that. So again, even in Nevada, they have a gambling commission that has idea that something has to be, there has to be some limits. Another no one could possibly want is rip-offs. That is that there are a lot of tricks being played on you to get you to pay a higher price. Notably, car dealers who are selling you an automobile, at least in the United States. A recent study by Ian Ayres and Siegelman looked at they sent in customers who were scripted to be identical except for race and sex into an automobile dealer. And so in other words, they'd send a woman in or they'd send a man in. And they were instructed to say exactly the same things to the dealer, or they'd send a black person in. And they found out that the dealers charged, on average, $1,000 more for a black male coming in. And secondly, it was about $400 more for a female. Now, why did they do this? Is it because, well, think about black males. Maybe they're prejudiced against black males and they want to hurt them. But they had a way of finding out because they had black salesmen and they had black-owned automobile dealership. And they found out that there was no difference. So a black salesman will do the same thing. It must be that black men in America, their culture is different, or their feelings of fear of something, that they don't bargain aggressively. And so they just get hit with a higher price. And this is, Ayers and Siegelman report that about 50% of the profits of US car dealers are earned from 10% of the customers. So when you walk in, they're looking at you as a possible sucker. And now, it's not that they're evil either, because there's competitive forces that put this on top of them. So now, I'm sounding very anti-free market, but I am not at all. In fact, I'm an entrepreneur. I've started 2 companies in my time, and I found it very rewarding and exciting. In one of my companies, Case Shiller Weiss Incorporated, we were selling online internet valuations of homes. And we also had a home price index, the S&P Case Shiller Home Price Index. But I remember talking with my president of our company about what we should charge. This was before Zillow and other online services give it away, but we were charging for an internet-based valuation of your home. So we were deciding whether we should charge $29.99 or $30. Now, you know why firms would say $29.99. It just sounds smaller, but it's only 1 penny smaller. So it's a trick, right? Everyone knows it's a trick. So I thought, well, should we do this? And I remember the conversation. Should we charge $29.99? Everybody else does it, so it's not going to look that bad for us. But, you know, on the other hand, it just seems sleazy to us. And it finally came down, we charged $30. And the reason we did is we had organizational slack. We had no competitors at that time. So we weren't so constrained, and we did what we thought was the right thing. It wouldn't have mattered horribly if we had done otherwise. But what I'm getting to now is I think that it's not, even a fishing equilibrium is another extreme ideal, which happens if there is no coordinated response to the fishing equilibrium. But there are coordinated responses, and these responses are in the form of civil society, and they come from both the government sector and from the private sector. But either way, they come from people who have integrity. I'm reminded of a famous book by A.O. Hirschman called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. This is 40 years ago, saying that there's a fundamental flaw in the idea of extreme free market equilibrium, that people should just use exit to complain about something they don't like. So the idea in an equilibrium, a free market equilibrium, has been, if you don't like our product, you can take your business elsewhere. And you would say, yes, I will do that. But what Hirschman documented is that that's not what happens very often. And one example he gave was schools, all right? This would be the American way, I should say the American way, or the free market way. You put your kid in a private school, and if you don't like it, you don't say anything. You pull the kid out and move to a competitor school. Maybe you send him to Trump University or something like that, okay? But he says, that's not the way it works well. And that's not what people do because they have integrity. So what happens if your child is not being treated properly at the school? You march into there and complain, and you talk to other parents. Ultimately, that produces a better outcome than just exiting as the idea. So it involves a social response. You start organizing a response. Ultimately, it comes down to some kind of heroism, and that's what I want to conclude this talk on. Civil society, that's another ancient phrase going back to Cicero, societas civilis. It means we have some sense of integrity for each other, and it's just innate to want to do that. Now, not everyone feels equally about that, but there are many people who do, and they tend to be unsung heroes. Now, I had a thought about, I think mostly the people who do this get no credit for doing it. And it lured me to thinking other thoughts about what makes people famous, what makes people celebrities. I was recently reading a sociologist who said, why is Charles Darwin so famous? Everyone knows who Charles Darwin is. Well, he said it's because he's controversial. And there's two sides constantly reminding of him. I was just thinking, why do we keep thinking about it? Here in America, someone did a poll and tried to find out what all the Republican presidential candidates thought about Charles Darwin. And the answer was, there were, I think, 12 candidates at that time for the US president nomination. 4 of them said outright, Darwin was wrong. The earth was created 4,000 or 5,000 years ago by God, and these scientists are a collusion and a fraud. The other 8 of them, including Donald Trump, wouldn't answer. There is not a single Republican candidate who would even venture that Darwin might be right. But that preserves his fame, because that's exactly why we're talking about him. So I'm thinking the discoverer of the atom. Anyone know who that is? This is a really important scientific discovery. I don't mean to challenge you. Some of you must know. John Dalton in England in around 1800 first got the idea that chemicals are made up of atoms and they form into molecules. Now that is an extremely important discovery. It maybe outweighs Darwin's discovery, but he's not remembered because nobody has any reason to debate it. We know that's right, so nobody cares. So I think we have heroes that are forgotten, and we try to, who help bring the equilibrium back to a good equilibrium. So, so where should I start? I'm going to list some of these heroes. Well, I've been mentioning drugs, food and drugs. I should say another thing. My heroes are mostly American, and that's my apology, because most Americans haven't even heard of them, but if I have any chance of hearing of them, they'd have to be American. There's a wonderful book by Daniel Rogers in 1998 called Atlantic Crossings, who documents how often ideas move back and forth about politics and economics between Europe and the United States. But you never know it, because politicians never want to tell you, I'm just copying an idea from that other country. They always present it as their own idea. So you only vaguely know of these heroes in your own country, but you don't know at all, no chance that you'd know of them in another country. So who created regulation of the drugs that I mentioned, the phony drugs that were widely sold in the United States? Well, I found 2 sort of famous names, Alice Lakey, a woman, and Harvey Washington Wiley, that led to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration in 1906. When I ask for a show of hands in American audiences, in an audience of this size, nobody will raise their hand. But I think they're sort of known among some people. When I went and gave a book talk in London, I thought, I better check. Maybe the British did this first. Sure enough, Britain had a Sale of Food and Drugs Act, 2 of them in 1875 and 1899. So I tried out on the Brits, and I found out who advocated them. Otto Hainer and Charles Casal. So I asked the British audience, does anyone know who these people are? 0. Nobody knows them. We form kind of funny heroes. So I have a whole list of names that we talk about in our book of potential heroes. I could go through more of these, but let me just, I'll mention one because it's very recent. Volkswagen was doing a fraud on the market by having a chip that would invalidate your tests of its emissions. And this was discovered. How was it discovered? Okay, this is a little known story, but Hewlett-Packard, the computer company, it was founded by Mr. Hewlett and Mr. Packard. Before they died, they created foundations. The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. These are nonprofit charitable foundations that pursued their vision. And now they're both dead and gone. The company is still going on, but their foundation is doing it. Now, one thing that Hewlett and Packard knew was that tests are tricky. It's not just easy and obvious how to test a product for anything. So they had given money to a testing group to just double check the government's testing. This is a business person out of their own business knowledge, and why are they doing this? It's out of their personal sense of integrity. This is what Hirschman called voice and loyalty rather than exit. So, and they did the test in a different way, and sure enough, they revealed the fraud. So we have heroes. Now, you only know about Hewlett and Packard if you own a Hewlett-Packard computer. Otherwise, you wouldn't have heard about this, probably. But I have many examples like that in the book. Let me just summarize them. The idea that I've been promoting is a fishing equilibrium, which in an extreme form replaces the basic utility maximizing paradigm of economics. We're going to drop the word utility and use something like wantability. The economy is designed to maximize the impulsive pleasures of the monkey on your shoulder. That's if there isn't integrity in civil society. It's flawed, the system is flawed because the kinds of manipulations are done by serious scientists who are trying to discover what will work. They don't even know why these different ad campaigns work. They just experiment with them. And if they do, funny thing, it's like movie producers. They can never predict when a motion picture will be successful. They have some idea. They're good at trying, but often they fail. It's the same thing with marketing. Not to say that marketing people are bad at all. Some of the marketing people, again, it's the fishing equilibrium. It's not. So we talk in our book about marketing pioneers, Ogilvy and Lasker, who tried to get more people to smoke cigarettes in the 1930s, and also tried to get women to smoke cigarettes against the cultural norms of the time. But later in their life, they gave generously to cancer research, and one of them stopped doing that. So at considerable profit expense. So the system works all right because of civil society, because of these heroes who are not remembered. They just did it out of their moral conviction. They might have been mildly famous in their day, but they did it out of moral commitment. These people are not fishers. They are people who are not doing it for fame, but are doing it out of a sense of principle. So I'll open it up now if there are any questions.
Professor Fisher, do you think that billions of dollars or francs or euros created by the private banks is the biggest fishing in the economy?
No, I don't know who is the biggest fisher in the economy. Private banks are okay. They're serving a... See, it really gets down to me about income distribution, which is a big international issue now, and is not part of this book. And I believe that nations should arrange some consensus on how unequal we'll allow our society to become. And this should be something that we do now in advance of waiting for it to happen. I am worried, and this is not in this book, and I'm not speaking for George Akerlof, I am worried that the growth of information technology, robots, machines replacing people, could bring a big increase in inequality. But my effort to relieve that would not be taking on the private banks. It would be taking on trying to develop a moral consensus that we won't let this kind of thing happen. So there could be a plan in a government announced now about what we are going to do when computers replace jobs. It's already happening, I think, but it could get even worse, replacing jobs for low-income, manual labor. We have to figure out what we're going to do. And I think it would be, I haven't looked at private banks. I presume that they're serving their customers, and we can do that, but there has to be something on top of, that we have to consider what's going to happen to people of moderate abilities in the future economy.
Rather than private banks, let me ask you about another institution with which you're more familiar. So you mentioned that scientists often will play a role in this fishing economy by developing a better potato chip, or at least a more wantable potato chip. What role do you think business schools play, where, in a sense, people are trained to figure out how to market products better, or a lot of people who go into finance come from? I mean, what role do you think business schools play, and do you see kind of a different type of role as being kind of a better role, a better model?
You're not part of a business school. You're economics department. A lot of business schools today are taking this finance and society theme up, maybe not founding a center, but at the Yale School of Management, there is a talk of a program. It's not a center. There's talk of making management a noble profession that you can be proud of. And I think that's actually happening around the world. I think there is. Well, I was thinking, I went to the Amos Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. And when I walked in the front door, they had engraved on the right by the door a quote from Amos Tuck, who was a businessman who gave to found the business school. And I can't remember exactly what it said, but it was very much in the spirit of what I've been saying. That business schools were often founded by people who wanted just this. They wanted a noble profession. It tends to slip back under a fishing equilibrium. I mentioned Trump University, which is not founded under those. I don't know, do you know what I'm talking about? It wasn't founded. So I have a joint appointment. I'm in the economics first, and I'm also in the management school second. I have a feeling that there's a demand and interest. Business people value their reputations. They value their ultimate gift to society. That's my strong feeling. And they don't want to be caught in a race to the bottom where you have to do things that don't feel right, but do them out of competitive pressures. So I don't think that business people, as a rule, are objecting to well-founded regulation. So one thing that we talk about in this book is we need government regulation. Now, business people are often upset by excessive regulation or petty regulation that gets them tied down in crazy details. So what we propose is that society reward regulators more heavily, make it into a career that they can believe in and aspire to. I think that they come through for us. I mentioned I have two companies. One of them was listing a new kind of security, and I went to the Securities and Exchange Commission as an innovator, financial innovator in Washington, D.C., and talked with them. And I felt that they were congenial people, and I respect and admire them. But I think they're overworked. They don't have a big enough budget. They have to be mindful of keeping regulations not to just become burdensome. They have to be mindful of cutting regulations that are no longer serving their purpose. But I think that there is a spirit in business schools today that reflects a sort of idealism that is actually fairly widespread in that community.
So thank you for the talk. I have a question. So the conclusion I get from it is that you're saying we should optimize for heroes because that would fix a lot of things. Now, if that is so, what is the #1 driving force you see within a society? Like, what do we need to work on most so that we get more heroes, so that our economy ends up in a better place?
Well, so you're talking to me as an educator. So I think that it's educators, at least that's where I'm coming from, have an important role. So I contemplated asking my students at Yale to sign the Giving Pledge as part of our class. That is a pledge that Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have been urging on billionaires around the world. And the pledge is to give away at least half of it while you're still young enough and attentive enough to make sure it goes right. I thought of doing that. Of course, my students probably won't become billionaires, so I thought they should freely sign it now at this young age. If I become a billionaire, I'm obliged to give it away. But I didn't actually ask them to sign it. I thought that was too imperious. But I'm trying to think of things like that. So examples like that, maybe better formulated, could help people think of the problem with capitalism is that it leads us to absurdities. You got your MBA, you go into business, you're doing great, you're making lots of money. Now you have tens of millions of dollars, maybe not $1 billion. And then what happens? Now you're getting old, you're still a business person, and you die leaving this to your children or whoever, and you never even thought about it. So your children are probably not as talented as you are if you're a successful business. The whole idea that Andrew Carnegie, and that I have my students read, in his Gospel of Wealth, is if you are successful in business, it means you have what he called a talent for affairs. That meant business. It used to mean business. If you have a talent for affairs and you're rewarded with sums of money, it is your moral obligation to give it away while you are still talented before you're old and feeble. And that's the Giving Pledge. I didn't come here thinking I was going to do this, but you asked me. And so I think that we have to separate out a sense of moral commitment to society as not inconsistent with a successful business career.
Can I come just back on one thing that you mentioned before? And I would be interested to hear on whether you consider Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank. Will they be remembered as the heroes, or will we forget about them?
Okay. I don't know Sarbanes or Oxley, but I have talked to both Dodd and Frank. Are they heroes? Sort of, yeah. They were politicians, and a politician has to be a compromiser, right? Things have to I don't think everything happened perfectly in those acts. They're very hard to read. The Dodd-Frank Act is almost 1,000 pages long, and it's not designed to be readable. You could suspect them of designing it to make it so unreadable that only the people in the know will know. But on the other hand, having met both of them and thinking about them and having tried to read their act, I don't think that they're not corrupt. I think they were motivated by trying to fix this financial crisis. Whether they did it right is a big question because it's such a complicated issue. And it comes back to all the other things that are being done. Here in Switzerland, for example, at the Financial Stability Board, which is giving advice to the whole world about how to fix the problems that caused the financial crisis. Are they doing a good job? Or at the Bank of International Settlements, there's so much finance, idealistic finance that goes on in Switzerland that I feel maybe I'm preaching to the wrong crowd here. But we already have a lot of these things here.
You mentioned earlier technology as a challenge. Could you also imagine that technology could be an opportunity to increase some kind of these moral challenges we have? And I'm thinking, for example, of the technology underlying the Bitcoin, the blockchain, which is called a kind of a consensus machine. Do you see any kind of chances there to use this technology also maybe to increase business ethics in general?
I find it very hard to predict what technology will do. The big question to me is whether new technology provides complements to working class labor or substitutes. If it's complements, then it will increase their demand. If it's substitutes, then it will work against them. And we just don't know the direction that it will take. Bitcoin is a very clever invention, and it became a bubble. The price of Bitcoins became a speculative fancy. But there's an underlying technology. Unfortunately, some of the technology was used to evade government regulation. People thought they could do anonymous transactions through Bitcoin, and that the government couldn't stop them. So that's not so inspirational. But there's now lots of cryptocurrencies, as they're called, and something probably will come out good on that if we have a civil society that manages it well. You have.
Professor Schiller, I have a question in a similar vein. How do you view the new business models arising, for example, thanks to new technology? The sharing economy would be an example.
Well, the sharing economy, as exemplified by Airbnb, which allows you to rent out rooms in your house, is, on the whole, a really remarkable step forward in technical progress that allows us to enjoy more goods and services without having to manufacture more of them. Or Uber, for example, which also makes it possible to use the existing stock of automobiles more effectively, and for people to use their free time more effectively driving their own car. We wouldn't have thought these things are possible. On the other hand, they create problems for certain people, like people who were driving a conventional taxi will lose the value of their medallion. So we have issues here. I think sharing economy is actually exciting. And I don't mean to be pessimistic about the future. As long as we maintain a civil society, we can make this new technology work to the betterment of all of us. Maybe that's a good thought to
Thank you.
stop. Or you have another.
Mr. Schiller, you mentioned regulation. How would you judge or even measure good regulation?
Well, good regulation has to have a clear purpose. It is not bought by the regulated. Gary Becker at the University of Chicago gave what he calls the economic theory of regulation. And that is, he said, that the regulated capture the regulators. And regulation ends up serving the profits of the regulated. For example, the medical doctors will impose restrictions on competitors, saying that you have to be trained at a recognized medical school to practice medicine. And the medical schools limit their admissions. So that what Gary Becker and later Milton Friedman took up as a cause was that we had too few doctors because of this, because of the medical association bribing the regulators to prevent. Licensing has become very important. And some of that, I'm thinking is right, is an effort to prevent competition. So how do we judge that? I think you have to look. Has the regulation on medical providers made it impossible for low-income people to get their service? Now, incidentally, I'm telling a story here now. Milton Friedman wrote a book called Free to Choose in the 1960s, pointing out how regulation can lead to bad outcomes. And the medical outcome was one of his prime examples. Within 5 years, a university in the United States created the first nurse practitioner program. This was an abbreviated MD. You could get it in fewer years. You would not be called a doctor, you would be called a nurse practitioner, but you would be allowed to do medical services of a limited nature. This was in response to Milton Friedman. He was right to criticize the existing regulation. It was too favoring doctors. Now, medical services are much more widely available, and you typically have a clinic with one medical doctor and two nurse practitioners who do a lot of the more routine medical care. And we've improved medical service by correcting this abusive regulation. So I've long said I'm an admirer of Milton Friedman to a limit. He points out some important things, but he made himself famous by taking an excessively extreme stand about free markets. And that made him, do you know who Milton Friedman is? Maybe not all of you do. But he was a famous conservative economist who was brilliant. He made some important points. He helped us correct regulations. But we didn't eliminate regulation as he would have advised. And for good reason. So he's gone now. Let's thank him for what he did. But let's also recognize that his fame is a result of his extremism.
Hi, regarding the idea of waiting for noble heroes, can't we just try to educate people to train the monkey, not to be fools?
Oh, my wife is a psychologist, and she tries to do that. We're learning more and more, and so I might also say that we have a behavioral finance. It's here at Zurich is a famous group in behavioral finance, behavioral economics. We're learning more and more about how the human mind works. And as we learn more and more, I think not only will we be better able to regulate, but we'll be better able to, somewhat train people to think differently. Okay.
So thanks a lot for all of you. Thanks a lot to Robert Schiller for his inspiring talk. Every event has come to an end. So my task is here just to thank you all and to wish you a good evening. I want to point out that this is one of many events that we have at the UBS Center. And if you want to know more, please go to our website. If you Google UBS Center, you will immediately find it. I can also announce we have another event in September. Paul Krugman is coming, and some of you may be interested also joining for that event. Thanks a lot for being here, and have a nice evening.